venture into White History Month, we should probably define what white is. When we look at anyone with light skin and features, we almost always assume that they're white. But historically in the United States, it's been a bit more complicated than that. Phrases like white people and white race originate from 17th century Europe during the Spanish and Atlantic slave trades. European explorers were fascinated to discover that people had different skin colors and bone structures in them, so it became important for them to differentiate between themselves and people with darker features. They developed what is commonly referred to as scientific racism that sought to define race based on biological differences rather than cultural differences. White is a term that historically has functioned as a descriptor of the dominant class. In the early British colonies of North America, religious identity and racial identity often went hand in hand. During the 17th century, the terms Christian, white, English, and free were used interchangeably to refer to white people. It wasn't until the emancipation of slavery when the term white became more popular, as many freed slaves were also Christian. White became more of a legal classification as laws limiting the rights of freed slaves started to emerge. The United States of America has often been referred to as a melting pot in reference to its diverse history of immigration. Whiteness in the United States is like an exclusive club that only certain people were allowed into. But when we look at the history of European immigration in the United States, we see that not everyone was allowed in the club. There were many reasons for this, but a big one was religious discrimination. The Protestant Reformation caused a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment among the British in the 16th century. In 17th century America, these sentiments were still felt among British colonizers who were largely Protestant. During the 19th century, Irish and German immigrants came to America in droves, and most of them were Catholic. They were referred to as the Whore of Babylon by many Protestant leaders and were met with a lot of hostility. A combination of religious discrimination and xenophobia helped establish those groups as distinctly non-white. Irish immigrants had to face a long list of stereotypes when they arrived to America and were often seen in the same light as African Americans. In many northern states, they were actually forced into the same rundown neighborhoods and slums as African Americans. Though they had a lot in common, Irish immigrants still sided with American slaveholders, even though at the time Ireland regarded slavery as a great evil. During a time when segregation and racial lines were drawn, European immigrants presented a complication. While they were from Europe, they weren't seen as white, and whiteness was tied to legal rights, specifically property and housing rights. So it became important for European immigrants to pursue the label white and to be seen as American. When we want to study the shift of European immigrants towards whiteness, examining the history of Chicago, Illinois is a great place to start. Chicago was home to numerous European immigrant groups, and like most immigrants to a new country, there was a pressure to assimilate into dominant culture in order to pursue a better standard of living. The history of property rights in Chicago can be traced back to treaties made between the Native Americans and the US government. The Potawatomi tribe controlled most of the land around Chicago until these treaties were signed. The land then belonged to the US government, and at the time only white people had the legally defensible right to property. So being white in Chicago meant so much more than nation of origin. It meant being included into a group that could legally own land. And that, of course, meant being able to start businesses and provide for their families. Eventually, European immigrants started to intermingle, and areas that were marked for one group soon became more intermixed. They often married across nationality, but within religious lines. As they intermixed, the distinct lines drawn between them became more blurred, and they simply became known as the American working class. When slavery was abolished in 1865, African Americans migrated from the South to Chicago and settled in the neighborhoods of European immigrants. As African Americans entered the working class, racial tensions between them and European immigrants increased as they found themselves competing in housing and employment markets. While labor fields were generally diverse, integration of black workers came at a snail's pace. Workplaces tended to be fairly clannish as people only chose to work with members of their own ethnic group. Trade unions attempted to bring people together, but there was often a job ceiling that prevented black workers from having higher paid crafts. As a result, black workers worked for much less pay. When white workers would go on strike, their employers would threaten to fire them and replace them with black laborers. This ensured that black workers worked for less, and also racial tensions increased against African Americans. In the race riot of 1919, Irish gangs incited violence against African Americans. Members of an Irish gang called Regan's Colts set fire to Polish and Lithuanian neighborhoods while wearing blackface. They did this hoping that these groups would attack African Americans in retaliation, but they didn't. So they raided an African American neighborhood called the Black Belt and murdered several people. The Black community retaliated, and this resulted in a riot that lasted 4 days. White identity in Chicago can almost be defined by the exclusion of people of color. Numerous settlement houses were established in the 1880s and 90s, and their goal was to remedy poverty among working-class European immigrants. While settlement houses were celebrated for their diversity, they still followed Jim Crow laws. Housing covenants were created to restrict options for certain racial groups. They generally said things like, "Herefore, no part of said property shall be occupied by a person not of the Caucasian race." And they'd often go into very blatant terms that stated that they wouldn't rent to anyone of the quote Negro or quote Mongoloid race. Their reasoning for this was, of course, to keep the neighborhood safe. Places like the Pullman plant community welcomed European immigrants from all nations and utilized racially restrictive covenants because they wouldn't rent to European immigrants otherwise. While many European immigrants might not have liked each other all the time, it became clear to them that there was social and political power in Black exclusion. The Gads Hill Center even had a blackface minstrel show in 1915 starring Polish and Bohemian actors that got rave reviews in the press. In the second quarter of the 20th century, real estate agent-sponsored companies fought to enforce racially restrictive covenants in Chicago. European immigrants signed into these covenants and as a result accepted a white ethnic identity. In 1919, Benjamin J. Rosenthal built Chicago's first model housing, Garden Homes. It was created as a haven of diversity, but was ultimately white only until an African American family moved in 1956. As a result, their house was burned down in an act of arson. Housing discrimination still continues to this day, and though segregation ended legally in 1964, the redlining of districts keeps Black and brown people in the same impoverished neighborhoods that they've been in historically. When you examine the history of European immigrants in the United States, it's not a history without oppression and abuse, but it is a history where assimilation towards whiteness and Black exclusion set a foundation for European immigrants to build themselves up in ways that many groups were not able to. And that's white history. If you like this video, you can support my work by becoming a monthly Patreon patron.